Okay, so third grade, we are going to be moving on to a new session this week. So we have spent the last several weeks talking about living things and what they're made of and why they're living. And we've talked about their traits and how they've adapted and changed over time. And we're going to be moving on to something completely different. And like you can see from here, we're going to be moving on to talk about forces, okay? So I know that in second grade, you guys talked a little bit about forces, but it's been a little bit of time, and so we're going to talk some more today. So I'm going to go through, and we're just going to talk a little bit basic about the different kinds of forces that we'll be spending a lot more time over the next several weeks talking and learning about. The first thing to know is that a force is a push or a pull. There are three examples of forces: magnetism, friction, and gravity. Those are all examples. Now, we will talk a lot about friction and gravity right now. Magnetism will come towards the end. So what are these three things? Well, magnetism is a force, and we'll get back to that, but it's going to be, is it a force, a push, a pull, or both? We'll find that out as we go through this unit. We also have friction, okay? Friction is a force that works against motion. So, for example, if I'm pushing something, there's friction working against it to make it harder to push. Friction works in the opposite direction as the motion. So, for example, when you lightly roll like a toy across the ground, like maybe a toy car, it's going to eventually stop moving because of friction. The third force that we talked about was gravity or gravitation force. And this is a pretty important one. It's the force that pulls us down towards Earth or pulls us towards something that has more mass. So if we look at this, the cat doesn't float up into the space because of gravity. It keeps it down on Earth. Gravity keeps us in orbit around the sun as well because the sun has a bigger mass than the Earth. So there are three kinds of forces that we're going to be talking about in this unit. We're going to talk about gravity, friction, and magnetism. So we really need to get to know what is a force. And like I said in that very first slide, a force is a push or a pull. Okay, so we're going to talk a little bit about some different examples of these sort of forces. So we're going to talk about a person called Sir Isaac Newton. He is a super famous scientist, but he was lived a long, long time ago, back in the 1600s. And he has some ideas about motion that people still use today. They're called the 3 laws of motion. So we're going to look at his very first one. And I know that you've heard of this before, but probably haven't heard about who actually made it. And his very first object law of motion says that an object in motion will stay in motion unless acted on by an unbalanced force in the direction of motion. It will maintain its speed and direction forever unless acted upon by an unbalanced force. Well, that is a lot of words and a very fancy way to say that something is going to keep moving until something makes it stop. Or the opposite could be said. Something's not going to move unless something makes it. So look at that picture of the girl on the skateboard that you see on your page. That girl on the skateboard is going to keep going and going until something makes her stop, be it the wind, be it a rock on the sidewalk, maybe her foot going down and pressing on the ground, but she will keep moving until something makes her stop. And the opposite could be true. So, for example, if you're holding something like this pen in my hand or that ball in that person's hand, it's going to stay there. It's not going to move unless something does something, either drops it or pushes it up. It's going to stay there until it's made to move. So Sir Isaac Newton, he discovered that first law of motion, that something that is moving will keep on moving until something makes it stop. And something that's not moving, something that's at rest, will not move, will stay still until a force acts on it. Makes it a push or a pull. So let's do a little bit of reviewing. A force is a push or a pull that makes an object move, stop, change speed, or change direction. So let's think about baseball. Mrs. Gillens loves to watch baseball games. So some forces that you might see in baseball are the ball being hit, the ball being pitched, somebody throwing the ball, somebody catching the ball, running to first base, stopping on first base. Those are all different kinds of forces. Friction. Friction is a type of force. It's the force that slows things down. If I take my hands and I rub them together, they start to feel warm, and that's because friction is acting on there. And we're going to spend a lot of time talking about what friction is and some examples of friction. Well, we also need to know what motion is. Motion is just moving. And then gravity. Gravity is that force that's pulling us down onto Earth, keeping us from floating up into space. And we talked about Newton's first law of motion. And that was that an object that is staying still will stay still until a force acts on it and makes it move. Or the opposite, an object that is moving will continue to move unless a force acts on it. So let's go back to that baseball thing that we talked about in forces, and let's talk a little bit more about that. So you might have a baseball pitcher, and he exerts a force on that ball to make it go. It's in his glove until he puts a force behind it and makes it move. That ball that he throws out of his glove is going to keep going in the very same direction and at the very same speed until one of these things happens. The batter hits the ball. The catcher catches the ball hits the backstop or wall and stops, or gravity and friction slow it down. Now, how fast that baseball moves is really going to depend on the size of the ball, the material of the ball, the size of the force, but it will keep going in the same direction and at the same speed until an opposite force, like the batter hitting it, the catcher catching it, the ball hitting the backstop, or gravity and friction stopping it. That's an example of Newton's first law of motion. So after this PowerPoint, there is some questions for you to answer, and then we are going to spend next week and the week after really starting to learn what a force is and talking more specifically about friction and about gravity and eventually about magnetism. And if you have any questions, make sure you ask Mr. Rusherai.